July 10, 1866. Scorching summer, South Carolina. A date that never made it into the history books, but one that marked with blood and silence the end of a lineage of oppressors. Mary Thompson. That was the name of the woman who, after years of being used as property flesh, decided to turn her own body into a weapon. Enslaved since birth, 26 years old, raised among cotton, sweat, and rape. Mary had been shaped to obey and punished every time she dared to dream beyond the slave quarters. For years, she served Master Richard Beaumont, like so many others, with lowered eyes, clenched fists, and a soul torn to pieces until he lied. He promised her freedom. He promised liberty in exchange for silence. And then he broke the pact. That night Mary didn't cry. She didn't beg. She didn't run. She prepared. She hid between her legs. An ancestral poison gathered with hands that had lost everything except memory, and when the master took her by force one last time, he also took his own sentence with him. Richard Beaumont died in agony. In the hours that followed, 10 overseers who had also soiled their hands with Mary's body fell one by one, choking, convulsing, vomiting in terror. What flowed from her body that night wasn't pleasure. It was justice. It was the end of a dynasty that thought itself eternal, and the birth of a whispered legend still told today among the woods, the shacks, and the bones of the earth. This is the true story of Mary Thompson, the enslaved woman who used her own body to make the empire of pain swallow the bitter taste of vengeance. But before we continue with the video, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is over there, and don't forget to hit that like button and hype this video up. They say cotton is soft. But on the fields of Carolina in the summer of 1866, cotton scratched like knives and stung like betrayal. The sun didn't shine, it punished. It pressed down on the backs of the enslaved like a second overseer, one that never slept, never blinked. Mary Thompson was born in that sun, born into chains so old they seemed part of the earth. Her first lullaby was the creak of wood under the weight of pain. Her first toy, a splintered stick shaped like a doll, left behind by a girl who'd been sold at 7. By 12, Mary had already bled from the lashes twice. By 15, she had stopped crying. By 18, she was called to the house, the kind of call every woman on the plantation dreaded. The house, the big house, where the walls whispered things no one dared repeat, where men with soft hands and hard eyes took what they wanted and left silence in their wake. Richard Beaumont, the master of the land, didn't shout. He didn't beat. He invited. He spoke in tones dipped in honey and laced with poison. "I've seen the way you carry yourself, Mary," he said once, tapping the side of his glass. "There's a strength in you. I could reward that reward as if her dignity were a coin to be traded." She nodded. That was the rule. You always nodded, but something inside her began to rot. Not fear, not sadness. Something deeper. The beginning of calculation. Scene shifts. A younger Mary kneels in the field, her fingers bleeding as she picks cotton. Nearby, an older woman, Mama Elsie, hums a tune, a spiritual, a warning. "You keep your head down, child," Mama Elsie whispered once, not looking up, "but keep your thoughts sharp. Sharp like the thorn under the bloom." And Mary did. For years she kept her thoughts sharper than any blade. But then came the lie, a promise, whispered by Beaumont himself. "Stay obedient, and I'll sign your manumission. Freedom by Christmas." Christmas came. No papers, no freedom, just the same door, the same bed, the same weight pressing down on her ribs in the dead of night. And the worst part, the way he looked at her afterward, like she should thank him. That night, under a sky swollen with stars, Mary sat in the dirt behind the cabins. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just remembered. 10 names, 10 overseers, 10 men who had taken turns. Laughter echoing through the fields like gunshots. 10. Final scene of the chapter. Mary presses her hand into the soil, deep, slow, pulls out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside, crushed leaves, dark powder, secrets passed from mother to daughter in a tongue long buried. The ground had kept her secret, but not for long, because Mary Thompson had decided the next time they touched her, they would die from it. The days after Christmas were colder than usual, not in temperature. The South still clung to warmth, but in silence, a silence that sank deeper than roots, heavy and unspoken. Mary walked the fields as always, her fingers numb, not from cold but from restraint. She moved like a shadow beneath the cotton stalks, her breath slow, her eyes sharp. The lie had settled into her chest like coal, smoldering, waiting. She saw him from afar, Richard Beaumont, riding through the rows on his gray stallion, boots polished, coat clean, smile fixed. He greeted the overseers with that same practiced charm, as if he hadn't shattered a soul just nights before. Mary kept her head down, but she listened, seen the quarters at night, whispered voices, flickering firelight. She really thought he'd free her. She ain't the first to believe a white man's promise. She won't be the last. Mama Elsie sat beside the fire, rocking slow. Her eyes never left the flame. They always lie, she said flat. But this one planted something inside her, and now it's growing. The next morning, Mary was summoned again, not to the house, but to the shed behind it. The shed where tools rusted, where screams didn't echo far. She stood inside while 3 overseers watched her. One of them, Jeb the youngest, smirked. He always smirked. "Master says you've been slow lately," he said, circling her. Thinking too much. That true girl. Mary didn't speak. "Maybe we remind you how to behave," another one added, pulling off his belt. They didn't see her fists tighten. They didn't hear the names being repeated in her mind. Jeb, Earl, Thomas, 3 of 10. Later, as she limped back to the quarters, she walked past the herb patch Mama Elsie kept hidden behind the smokehouse. Mary didn't stop, didn't bend down, didn't need to. She already had what she needed. What she wanted was time. Scene shifts, memory. Mary, at age 8, watching her own mother scream into a pillow as blood soaked the mattress. Richard Beaumont, younger then, buckling his pants as he walked out like it meant nothing. Mary had learned early they don't stop because you cry. They stop when you make them bleed. That night she sat alone, grinding dried roots between 2 stones. The powder filled the air with a bitter sting, a mix of bark, wild berries, and the dried sap of a plant her grandmother once called God's last defense. Mama Elsie approached slowly. She didn't speak, just sat beside her, watched. After a long silence, she finally said, "You going to need more than poison to kill the devil?" Mary didn't look up. "I'm not just killing him," she whispered. "I'm killing what he thinks he owns." Mary knew that to kill a man like Richard Beaumont, a man protected by law, land, and fear, she would need more than rage. Rage burned quick. She needed something older, something quiet, a death that could not be traced back to a scream. So she turned to the earth. Long before the chains, before the ships, before the names were stolen, her people knew how to kill with silence, and that knowledge buried deep in root and ritual still lived in whispers passed from hand to hand, from mouth to ear, from mother to daughter. Mary waited until the moon was thin and the air thick with mist. Then she slipped from her quarters, bare feet pressing into the cold dirt behind the smokehouse. The others slept or pretended to. No one asked where she went. They'd seen the shift. In her eyes, that stillness that came before a storm. She moved through the plantation like smoke, invisible and determined, until she reached the patch behind Mama Elsie's hut. There the weeds grew thick and tangled, and hidden among them were the old plants, bitter root, bloodroot, and the flowering devil's trumpet. She dug with her hands, feeling for the ones that whispered death. Some roots she recognized from stories. Poisons that burned the belly, slowed the breath, made the skin weep. Others she didn't know, but they called to her anyway, dark and potent. She took what she needed, wrapped them in cloth, and returned without a word. In the following days, Mary barely spoke. She worked the fields like always, eyes low, back straight. But at night, by candlelight, she ground her ingredients into powder. Each stroke of the pestle was deliberate, patient, a ritual. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of what she was making. She remembered her grandmother's hands, strong and steady, mixing oils and herbs in the shadows of a hut far across the sea. Poison, her grandmother once said, is not just for the body, it's for the balance. When a man breaks the law of life, you return him to the soil. And Mary would. The mixture was almost ready, black as coal, bitter as sorrow. But she had one last step, one last vessel, her own body. She washed herself in cold water, scrubbing the dirt and sweat of the fields from her skin. Then she took the powder, wrapped it in waxed cloth, and hid it deep inside her. The act made her flinch, not from pain, but from knowing what it meant. Her body, the very thing they had stolen again and again, would now become the weapon. The place of their pleasure would become their grave. She dressed in silence and waited for the summons. It came that evening, as expected. A knock at the quarters, a voice too polite to be kind. "The master wants you in the house." Mary walked step by step like a woman going to her wedding or her execution. But she wasn't walking toward death. She was bringing it with her. The house loomed above the fields like a crown of rot. All's whitewashed walls and glowing windows, standing proud on the bones of the stolen. Mary had walked those steps before. She knew the creak of each board on the porch, the cold brass of the doorknob, the hush of the carpets meant to muffle the weight of what happened inside. But this time her steps were different. She wasn't a girl anymore. She wasn't afraid. She was ready. The door opened with a slow groan. Inside, the air was thick with perfume and heat. Richard Beaumont was already waiting, coat off, suspenders loose, eyes drunk, not with wine, but with the hunger of possession. He smiled at her like he always did, the kind of smile that mistook cruelty for charm. "You took your time," he said, setting down his glass. "You're learning to make a man wait." Mary didn't answer. She had learned something, yes. Not how to wait, but how to end. He motioned to the bed. She moved like before, slow, graceful, silent. She undressed, not with shame, but with purpose. Every layer she removed brought her closer to the act, not of submission, but of execution. Beaumont approached, his fingers greedy, his breath sour. He touched her. He kissed her. He entered her as he'd done before, but this time the pleasure he sought carried the promise of death. The poison wasn't instant. That was the plan. It needed time, just enough to be absorbed. Through skin and membrane, through breath and blood. A slow fire kindled in the most sacred place. Mary kept her face calm, her body still, but inside her pulse beat like drums from another continent. She watched his eyes flicker, his breath catch, his movement slow. He leaned back, confused. "What? What's wrong with me?" Mary didn't answer. He stood staggering toward the wash basin, then to the wall, then to the floor. His hands clawed at his stomach, his throat, his own skin, trying to tear out what was already part of him. "Mary," he gasped, "what did you—" She walked to the door. She didn't run. She didn't look back. Behind her, Richard Beaumont collapsed, the master of the house reduced to convulsions on the rug. His voice broke into a wet gurgle, his body twisted like a serpent with no spine. By the time the first capitas entered the room, drawn by the sound of something unholy, Beaumont was seizing, his eyes rolling white, his mouth foaming. Mary stood in the hall watching. And when the second man arrived, and then the third, all of them touching the same stained sheets, the same poisoned skin, the plan unfolded like fire across dry grass. 10 men had used her, 10 men would now die by her, and the first had already begun to rot. The moment Richard Beaumont's body hit the floor, something ancient shifted in the air. It wasn't loud, not yet. The sound he made was a low, wet gurgle, like a creek choking on mud. But Mary heard it like thunder. The soft tremble of his limbs against polished wood echoed in her ears, louder than a slave bell, louder than the crack of a whip. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but reality had its own weight, heavier and more brutal. He was dying, and it wasn't slow anymore. Mary stood in the hallway, just outside the bedroom door, the shadows wrapping her like a second skin. Her breath was steady, her heart a silent drum. She could hear him now trying to crawl, fingers scraping against the floor, shoes kicking uselessly. A man who had spent his whole life towering over others was now reduced to trembling flesh. He gasped her name, not as a command, not as a demand, as a plea. Mary, she didn't move. Behind her, the hallway flickered with candlelight. The scent of perfume and sweat hung in the air like a ghost. Downstairs, a clock chimed once, marking the final moments of a century-old legacy of violence coming to an end on a rug soaked in bile. Then came the footsteps. Jeb was the first of all. Of course, he was always the first to come when the master called, like a dog expecting scraps. Mary didn't look at him as he passed. He didn't notice her at all. All he saw was the crumpled body on the floor, the convulsions, the blood streaked. Spit. What the? Jeb knelt beside the master, hands fumbling at Beaumont's collar, slapping his cheeks. Sir, what the hell happened? Beaumont's mouth opened, but nothing coherent came out. Just a strangled sob, a final twitch, then stillness. Jeb stared down at him, and for the first time since Mary had known him. The overseer looked small. He turned to her, then eyes wide. "What did you do?" he snapped. Mary didn't answer. She didn't need to. Beaumont's face had already started to turn. A sickly gray blue crept across his cheeks. His eyes, glassy, lifeless, stared past Jeb, past Mary, towards something neither of them could see. Jeb stood up, backing away. Panic bloomed across his face. Then he touched the bed, the same bed Mary had prepared. The same sheet soaked in the same venom, and the moment his palm pressed down on that linen, his fate was sealed. He didn't collapse right away. That was the thing about the poison. It wasn't quick. It wanted to crawl through the body inch by inch, feeding on warmth, smothering breath. Jeb staggered out of the room, clutching his stomach. His mouth opened as if to shout, but no words came, only a sound, raw and childlike. It wasn't a scream, it was a cry. A man who had laughed while others bled, now crying like a boy. Mary stepped aside as he passed her, not bothering to touch him. He was already marked. The poison would do its work. She walked down the hall, quiet, composed. Behind her, Jeb collapsed against the wall, heaving, groaning, begging for someone, anyone. But there would be no one to save him. He would die just like the master, alone, undone by the body they thought they controlled. By the time Mary reached the stairs, 2 more overseers were rushing up, Earl and Thomas. She recognized the sound of their boots before she saw their faces. Loud men, cruel men, both had laid hands on her more than once, laughing, spitting, saying things they didn't even consider shameful. "Where's the master?" Earl barked, pushing past her. She didn't answer. Thomas paused, looking her up and down. His eyes narrowed. "What's going on?" "You look different." "I am," she said simply. And then she was gone into the darkened parlor below, her bare feet silent against the floorboards. In the bedroom, chaos bloomed. Thomas and Earl found Jeb curled in the hallway, eyes rolled back, foam bubbling at his lips. Inside, Beaumont lay. Still, eyes open, chest unmoving. "Jesus Christ!" Thomas shouted. "What the hell happened?" Earl said, stepping backward. But as he spoke, his hand went to the headboard of the bed, the same stained wood Mary had leaned against. His fingers brushed the damp imprint of her skin. He blinked, paused, then coughed. It started small, a dry, irritated rasp. Then came the burn. Downstairs, Mary entered the kitchen. It was empty, dark. A few candles still burned low. On the far table, someone had left a pitcher of water and a bowl of apples. She didn't touch them. She sat instead on the edge of a stool, facing the door, waiting. Above her, the floorboards creaked and groaned, not with footsteps, but with bodies falling. More cries, more panic, men shouting names, a chair crashing, the heavy thud of flesh hitting the floor. The house had become a tomb. Minutes passed, then heavy boots on the stairs. 1, 2, 3 sets. Ben, Silas, and Malcolm, all armed, all red-faced, sweating, scared. "Where is she?" one shouted. "Where is that bitch?" Mary stood slowly, her hands open. They saw her and raised their weapons, pistol, whip, knife. "What did you do to them?" Malcolm screamed, stepping closer. "Gave them what they gave me," Mary replied. Silas lunged first, grabbing her by the arm, but he froze. His skin brushed. Hers, sweat against sweat. She had oiled herself again. The poison still clung to her like a second skin. He looked at his palm, then back at her, eyes wide. No, it was too late. His mouth opened to shout, but only bile came. He dropped to his knees. Ben ran. Malcolm stood frozen. Mary didn't chase either of them. They would fall soon enough. By dawn, 8 men were dead. 2 more fled into the woods, clutching their stomachs, coughing, foaming at the mouth. Their bodies would be found days later, curled under trees, eyes wide in terror. The plantation was quiet, too quiet. The birds didn't sing that morning, the wind didn't blow, just the creaking of an empire rotting from the inside. Mary stood in the field staring at the house. Smoke curled from the chimney. Blood stained the steps. Behind her, the other enslaved workers began to emerge, cautious, trembling. They saw the bodies. They saw Mary. No one spoke until one voice, small, trembling, broke the silence. "You did this?" Mary turned slowly. A girl, 14 maybe, eyes wide, voice shaking. Mary nodded once. Another voice rose, then another, and another. Not questions, not cries, just one word. How? Mary looked at the sky, then at her hands, and said with what they thought was mine. Smoke still clung to the rafters of the big house. The light outside had changed. Dawn, no longer golden, but pale, sickly, as if the sun itself hesitated to rise over a place that had just swallowed its own masters. Inside, the stillness was not peace. It was aftermath. The kind of silence that follows a scream so long and so violent that the throat simply gives out. Mary stood barefoot on the wooden floor, her toes stained with something too dark to be dust. Around her, the corpses of men who had once stood taller than Lore, now curled like children in death, their faces twisted, their hands frozen mid-clutch, one reaching for a doorknob, another still gripping his whip. None had died with dignity. That was part of the justice. Their power had come from posture, from control, from standing above others. Death made them small. Death made them equal. Mary looked down at Jeb's body slumped in the hallway, his mouth still parted in an unfinished question. His final sound had not been a command or a curse. It had been a cry, a soft, frightened cry. The poison had done its work, and Mary's body, once forced to serve as object, as instrument, as unending offering, had become the altar of their undoing. She moved through the house slowly, her breath steady, her steps measured. She touched nothing. She had already touched enough. She passed the shattered glass in the study, the overturned chair in the parlor, the broken body of Earl still twitching on the rug. The walls no longer whispered secrets. They screamed them now, wide open, bleeding. The big house had always been the heart of the plantation. Now it was its tomb. Outside the sun broke weakly through the clouds. The cotton fields waited in silence, and from the edge of the quarters the other enslaved began to step forward. One by one, quiet, careful, eyes wide, mouths closed. They had heard the sounds in the night, the screams, the crashing, the silence that followed. Now they came to see what was left. Mary stepped out into the open air. It was colder than it. Should have been. She didn't shiver. Her body had become something else more than flesh. She was not afraid. She didn't need to speak. They saw her. They saw what she had done, and she saw what she had become in their eyes. Not a woman, not a slave, not even a killer, something older, something sacred. A small child clutched her mother's skirt and whispered, "Is it true?" The mother didn't answer. She just stared. Behind her, more came. The field hands, the cooks, the stable boys, the women with skin that still bore bruises and backs that remembered the whip. They came not to challenge, not to mourn, but to witness, to see with their own eyes that it was real, that someone had finally struck back, that someone had turned the master's house into a grave. Mary looked out across the cotton. It stretched like a sea, white and endless, but now it looked different. The stalks no longer seemed soft. They looked like bones, 1,000 little markers jutting from the dirt, each one grown from suffering. And today at last something had bloomed that did not serve the master. She didn't speak to them. Not at first. She just stood. The wind caught the hem of her dress, now stained and torn, and carried with it the scent of sweat, smoke, and blood. And in that moment something shifted. Not in Mary, but in the people watching her. Shoulders straightened, eyes lifted, the air changed. A voice finally rose from the group, cracked, unsure. What do we do now? Mary looked at the woman who had asked. Her hands were shaking, her eyes were wet, but she had spoken. That in itself was a revolution. Mary stepped forward just once. No speeches, no grand declarations. She placed her hand on the woman's shoulder and nodded. Then she turned back toward the house. Behind her, the others began to follow, first a few, then more, until the entire yard moved as one body, hesitant, then sure. Not a mob, not a rebellion, something older, something slower. A choir, the choir of the living. They entered the house not to loot, not to burn, not yet, but to see, to witness. They walked over the bodies of men who had whipped them, cursed them, taken their daughters, buried their sons, and none of them wept. In the master's bedroom, a woman knelt and picked up Mary's headscarf, left behind in the sheets. She held it, like it was a relic. In the hallway, a boy no older than 9 touched the blood on the floor and whispered a name, not his own. The name of his father, long gone, taken, buried in the very ground that grew the master's wealth. All of them began to speak, not loudly, not in shouts, but in murmurs, prayers, old songs, half-forgotten words passed down in the dark. And Mary, in the center of it all, said nothing. Her silence was the hymn. Her breath was the rhythm. Her body still standing was the gospel they all understood. That flesh could be broken and still carry justice. That pain could become a blade. That survival, when chosen, could become prophecy. Outside, the smoke began to rise. Someone had lit the back of the house, slow, careful. The fire crept like memory, licking the windows, cracking the paint. The house moaned, and no one stopped it. Mary stepped away first toward the fields, toward the place where it had all begun. Her feet found the dirt, like they were returning home. Behind her, the others followed again, not in fear, not in flight, but in procession, a funeral for the master, a birth for themselves. The cotton swayed. The fire roared behind them, and somewhere deep beneath their feet, the ancestors stirred. Mary didn't look back. There was nothing left behind her worth seeing, only ahead, only forward. And the earth at last felt light beneath her step. The forest had always been there, just beyond the fields where the cotton ended and the wild began. Most of the enslaved had only seen it from a distance, a shadowed promise wrapped in rumor and fear. Some said it held ghosts, others swore it swallowed runaways whole. But now, under a sky stained with smoke and memory, the forest was no longer myth. It was refuge. Mary walked at the front, her pace even, her eyes sharp. The dirt path narrowed, Branches clawed at her skin, roots twisted beneath her feet like traps waiting to snap. But she didn't stumble. She couldn't. Behind her, others followed, silent, breathless, their bodies still vibrating with the weight of what they'd witnessed. They moved not as a crowd, but as an echo of her, one heartbeat fractured into many. She hadn't planned this part. The killings, yes. The revenge, yes. But the rest, the exodus, the flight into the unknown. This was new terrain, her body now. Her weapon, pulsed with the remains of what she had done. She could still feel the poison lingering inside her, like a second heartbeat, slow and humming. Her muscles ached. Her thighs burned from where the mixture had seared her skin, but she didn't let it show. They reached a clearing just before nightfall. The trees opened into a patch of damp earth, shielded by thick vines and moss. A creek babbled nearby, cold and clean. No one spoke. The children huddled near their mothers. The elders sank to the ground without words. The fire from the plantation still glowed faintly on the horizon, but here the air was cooler, wilder. Mary crouched by the water, cupped it into her hands, and drank. The cold bit her tongue, ran down her throat, like a baptism. She splashed her face and let herself exhale. For the first time since the bodies fell, she felt her lungs open. She didn't cry. She hadn't earned that yet. A rustle behind her made her turn. It was a boy, 12, maybe 13, with eyes too old for his face. He didn't say anything, just stared. "Do you need something?" she asked, her voice arrow. He shook his head. "Then you going to keep leading us?" Mary paused. "I didn't mean to lead." The boy frowned. "You think we followed you by accident." She looked past him toward the others. They had begun gathering sticks, forming rough shelter, tending to wounds. No one looked lost. No one looked ready to turn back. "I don't know what happens now," she said softly. He nodded. "Then we figure it out together." And just like that, he walked away. Mary stayed by the water a while longer. The cold soothed her raw skin. Her reflection stared back at her, not gentle, not cruel, just changed. There was something in her eyes she hadn't seen before. Stillness. A silence not of fear, but of certainty. She rose just as the first cries rang out, not from children, not from grief, but from men. Pain. She turned fast, her instincts flaring. Two of the older boys, Benji and Isaiah, came stumbling from the trees, faces pale, arms scratched. "They're coming," Benji gasped. Two white men. Guns! Mary's heart didn't race. It steadied. "How close?" she asked. "Real close." She moved like a ghost through the camp, not yelling, not panicking, just presence. She touched shoulders, pointed to trees, directed children to hide, women to scatter, men to stay low. They didn't question her. The choir that had followed her from the blood-soaked house now moved with silent harmony. No one screamed. No one fled. They vanished into the green, like wind into grass. Mary stayed near the edge, eyes narrowed, listening. Then she saw them, Malcolm and Ree, two of the last overseers. Somehow they had survived. The poison hadn't finished them, or maybe they hadn't touched enough of it to die right away, but they looked half dead, faces sunken, eyes wild, clothes stained with blood and sweat. Ray's walked with a limp. Malcolm dragged his rifle like it weighed more than him. Mary stepped into view. They froze. "You," Malcolm spat. "You did this." She didn't answer. Reese raised the rifle shaky. "We should have killed you the first time you opened your mouth." Mary took a step forward. "You touched me. You beat me. You laughed while I bled. Another step. You thought you owned me." She opened her arms, slow, deliberate. "You want to finish it? Come." Malcolm screamed and charged. Reese aimed and fired. The shot missed, cracked the bark beside her. She didn't flinch. Malcolm reached her first, tackled her hard. They hit the dirt together, rolling. He clawed at her throat, spit in her face, called her names she'd heard since childhood. But Mary wasn't a child. She knot him in the ribs, grabbed the rock beside her and slammed it into his temple. Once, twice, his body convulsed, then stopped. Reyes screamed, dropped the rifle, charged with a knife, too slow. Benji came from behind, swinging a broken branch. It cracked across Reese's back. He stumbled. Isaiah grabbed his leg. The others surged forward, not with fury, but with focus, controlled, quiet. Reese was pulled down into the mud, hands pressed. Him into the earth. No cries, no pleas, just silence, and then stillness. Mary stood over them, chest heaving. It was over, truly over. That night they buried Malcolm and Ree far from camp, not out of respect, but to keep the stink away. No one marked the graves. No one would return. Mary sat by the creek again, alone. The moon hovered above the trees, bright and pitiless. She washed the blood from her arms, her face, her thighs. The water turned red, then clear again. She whispered to no one, and to everyone, "I am not sorry." And somewhere in the distance, deep in the dark, a bird called out. Not a cry, not a warning, but a song. The forest didn't sleep, not really. Even as darkness poured over the trees and the stars blinked awake, the woods breathed with tension. Insects murmured in the brush. Branches creaked. Somewhere far off, an owl screeched low and long, a warning or a witness. It was hard to tell. But among the trees in the hidden clearing by the stream, a different kind of silence took root. Not fear, not despair, but a silence of watching, of waiting. Mary hadn't closed her eyes in over 30 hours. Her body, though aching, stayed alert, not out of duty, but necessity. The venom she had carried inside her, the men she had watched die by it. The fight by the creek, all of it still buzzed under her skin like static. She didn't know how long. Her body could hold out. It didn't matter. The time for pain had passed. What remained was vigilance. She sat beneath a large oak near the edge of the camp, her back pressed to the bark, her knees drawn up, a cloth-wrapped stone resting in her lap. It wasn't a weapon, not yet. Just wait, something to hold on to, something to remember the earth. By the others slept in shifts. Mothers curled around children like armor. Elders laid flat on their backs, breathing heavy through their mouths. The men, what few adult ones remained, took turns watching the perimeter, walking slowly with sticks or rusted blades scavenged from the plantation's tool shed. They all looked. To her now, not just with respect, but with a kind of reverence that unsettled her more than the gunfire had. She hadn't asked to be followed. She hadn't asked to be believed, but now she couldn't step out of the clearing without eyes turning, bodies straightening. She was no longer just Mary. She had become a shape larger than any name, a vessel of justice, a weapon that breathed. And she was afraid of what came next, because vengeance had filled her, sustained her. But it was a fire, and fires never sleep. What happens when the flame has nothing left to burn? A rustle in the trees broke her thoughts. She reached for the stone, instinct sharp. A figure stepped from the brush, slow, hands raised. It was Ruth, the midwife, old, quiet, eyes like burnt coals. Mary relaxed her grip, nodding once. "You should sleep," Ruth said, settling beside her. "I can't," Mary replied. Ruth looked at her. Can't or won't. Mary didn't answer. She stared at the dark as if it might open and show her something useful. Ruth chewed a stalk of grass and sighed. "You remind me of someone," she said. "Woman I knew in Georgia a long time ago. She poisoned the overseer's mule. Just the mule sent a message without taking a soul." Mary looked over slowly. "What happened to her? They sold her South Deep. We never heard from her again." Mary nodded once. Silence returned, but not empty silence. The kind filled with ghosts, pressing close to listen. After a while, Ruth said, "You don't have to carry it all." Mary's eyes stayed on the dark. "I do," she said. Ruth didn't argue, just patted her knee once and stood. "You ain't done," she said. "But you ain't alone neither." And with that, She vanished back into the brush as quiet as she came. Mary sat there a while longer, the weight of the stone heavier now, not in her hands but in her chest. Before dawn, something changed. The birds didn't sing. The wind shifted. A branch snapped where it shouldn't. Mary rose before the others. She moved through the trees like breath, like shadow, her bare feet silent in the pine needles. She scanned the darkness. Every sound measured, every scent registered. Then she saw them, not close, but near enough. A search party, white men with rifles, dogs, and lanterns, moving slow, spread wide, looking not to kill, not yet, but to capture. She backed away, heart steady. When she returned to the camp, the others were already stirring, faces alert, bodies upright. They felt it too. The forest had turned. "They're close," Mary said. Too close. The people didn't panic. They'd already burned through fear. What remained was a kind of cold clarity. "What do we do?" someone asked. Mary's eyes swept across. Them, the mothers, the men, the wounded. They couldn't run fast, not all of them. The children would slow them. The forest would betray their steps. Dogs would follow scent. They had two choices, hide and wait or stand and fight. She thought of her mother's body, dragged from the big house with blood on her legs. She thought of the screams in the night, the broken backs, the shallow graves. Mary stood tall. "We fight. No cheers, no war cries, just nods. Acceptance, resolve." They had nothing to lose, and everything already taken. The battle wasn't long. It never is when one side has no fear of dying. They struck just before the sun cracked the horizon. Mary and the strongest men at the front, the women flanking the sides. The children hidden deep in the creek bed behind a wall of stone. The search party didn't expect resistance. They didn't expect Mary. The first shot came from a stolen musket. The second was a thrown axe. Then it was all fists, knives, branches, screams. Mary fought with no rhythm, only purpose. She remembered every hand that had gripped her wrist, every boot that had pressed her down, every mouth that had lied. She moved like storm, like hunger. She broke a man's nose with her elbow, drove her knee into another's chest, and when one aimed a pistol at a young boy crawling to safety, she drove the blade of a garden trowel into his neck. There was blood, everywhere, but she didn't flinch. By the time the smoke cleared, 5 white men lay dead. 3 had run. 2 of them wouldn't make it far. They had no dogs left. The forest belonged to Mary now. She washed again that night for the last time, not just to clean, but to shed. The poison was gone from her body, burned out by fire, rage, and use. But something else had taken root, a quiet, a stillness, not peace, but something close. She looked at her reflection again, this time not searching for who she was, but for who she'd become. She didn't recognize her face, and that was okay, because her face would never belong to one woman again. It would belong to all of them, to the ones still shackled, to the ones buried nameless, to the ones not yet born. She had become the him they needed, the body they remembered, the vengeance they feared. The forest was quiet again, but it was not the quiet of peace. It was the hush after a storm, the kind of silence that settles when blood soaks the roots and ghosts begin to listen. Smoke from the skirmish still lingered in the air, caught in the branches like whispers not yet spoken. The wind carried the scent of gunpowder, sweat, and something older, the scent of ending. Not all who followed Mary had survived. 2 men, 1 woman and a boy, no older than 10, now lay wrapped in cloth and buried shallow beneath moss and mud. The children didn't cry. The elders didn't wail. Grief had no volume here. It sank deep, low, silent, the way it always had. Mary knelt at the edge of the graves with her hands pressed into the soil, fingers spread, her breath low and even. She didn't pray, she didn't speak. She simply pressed her palms into the earth until it felt like something answered back. She didn't cry, not for them. Not because she didn't feel it, but because tears for her had become a luxury reserved for those who still had time. She had work left. Night came again like a curtain drawn slow. The forest, now shelter and graveyard, breathed softly in the dark. Fires burned low. The survivors huddled close, not for warmth but for memory. They no longer needed to speak to understand each other. They had crossed a threshold together, through death, through fire, through vengeance, and now existed in a kind of suspended truth, not free, not safe, but aware, alive in a way that most people never get to be. Mary sat alone back against a tree, eyes half closed. Her limbs ached, not just from the battle, but from carrying what she knew, that what had happened could not be undone, that the house would rebuild, that new masters would rise, that freedom, if it came, would not come, gentle. But still, there was power in what had been done, not just in the deaths, but in the silence that followed, the kind that reached beyond the bodies and into the bones of the land. A voice came from the dark, deep, steady, familiar. It was old man Jeremiah, whose back had been broken years before, and yet still moved like wind through tall grass. "Mary," he said, stepping into the firelight, "I heard the names." She looked at him, waiting. "The names of the dead. They're not just gone. They're echoing now through us." She nodded once. He crouched beside her, his knees popping with age. "You did something," he said, voice soft as dirt. "Not just for us here, but for all them who never got the chance." Mary didn't speak. She stared into the fire, her jaw set. "You made their silence speak," he said. "That's not small." She looked at him finally, and her voice, when it came, was dry as ash. "It's not over." "No," Jeremiah said, "but now it's begun." Others joined them, drawn not by invitation but by instinct. One by one they sat, women with blistered hands, children with eyes wide as sky, men who had forgotten how to look others in the face. Now they all looked to her, not as leader, not as savior, but as witness. They wanted to hear her speak, not of plans, not of orders, but of what had already been done. Mary leaned forward, her elbows on her knees, and began to speak, not loudly, not fast, but with weight. She told them of the day she stopped being afraid, of the night she carried death inside her, of the moment Richard Bowman's eyes turned glassy and she felt her body become a verdict. She told them of Jeb's final cry, of the way silence fell after the 10th overseer's body stopped twitching. She told them how the house moaned as it burned, how the cotton bowed not in wind but in memory. She spoke not as a hero, but as a vessel. She told it plain, and when she was done she said nothing more. No one applauded, no one wept. They sat. In the quiet her words left behind, as if listening to the land for a reply. Then the oldest woman there, her name long forgotten, known only as Granny Mo, reached into the folds of her skirt and pulled out a tiny pouch. She placed it at Mary's feet. "I carried this since my mother," she said, "for when the time came." Mary picked it up. It was soft, hand-stitched, filled with crushed leaves and something that smelled like rust and rain. Granny Mo said, "It's for memory. You burn it and the dead will hear you." Mary closed her hand around it. Her throat tightened. Then a boy brought her a rock, smooth, flat, with a symbol carved crude into its face for marking. Another woman brought her a strip of red cloth. Another, a small blade. One by one they gave her tokens, not gifts, not offerings, pieces of themselves, of those who had died, of those who had lived to remember. Mary took each one, saying nothing, and when she rose, the others rose too. They didn't know what came next, but they knew they would not return, not to the plantation, not to the whip, not to the name slave. By dawn, the clearing was empty. The graves had been covered, the fire buried, no path left behind. Only the faint imprint of feet in the moss, and the weight of something sacred lingering in the trees. The forest had listened. The dead had spoken, and Mary Thompson, once a name whispered in agony, had become something else entirely, a story that would not die, a song made of silence, The sun rose slow and red, bleeding through the trees like it had been watching. The group moved as one body, quiet and steady, feet pressing into soft earth, leaving no trail behind. The forest gave way to marsh and beyond that hills. They walked until the air turned warm again, until the scent of pine became cane, and the cries of birds gave way to distant windmills. They were deep now, far from the cotton fields, beyond the reach of horses and hounds. But Mary knew safety wasn't something promised. It was something taken. They stopped at the edge of a tall sugar grove. The stalk swayed with the wind thick and high, a wall of green whispering with every gust. Mary stepped forward alone. The others waited. She moved between the canes, the leaves brushing her arms, cutting tiny lines across her skin. Each step sank slightly into mud. The smell of sugar and rot filled her lungs. It smelled like everything they had survived. Sweet and spoiled, she walked until she couldn't hear them any more, until even the birds grew quiet. Then she knelt. She dug with her hands, slow and careful, until the soil gave way to dampness, worms, and the unseen breath of the dead. From her satchel she pulled the cloth-wrapped tokens, the pouch from Granny Mo, the stone with its carved mark, the blade, the red cloth, the ashes from the night she watched the plantation burn. She placed them in the earth one by one, no prayers, no chants, just truth. When it was done, she covered them gently and pressed her palm flat against the ground, and she whispered, not to God, not to the living, but to the ones who still waited beneath the cane, to every woman whose name they never wrote down, to every child torn from arms too tired to fight, to every man broken before he could break back, I carried you, and now you carry me. The wind caught her words and pulled them deep into the grove. She stayed like that for a long time. When she stood, she did not look back. She walked through the cane and returned to the others, her face unreadable, her shoulders taller. They saw her and did not question. They simply followed. Together they moved farther west to higher ground, to places where no maps waited. They would build there, not with blueprints, but with memory, not with permission, but with purpose. The world would never know exactly where. Mary Thompson went. Some said she was seen in Mississippi, her hands planting cassava in dirt that had never tasted slavery. Others claimed she died in Texas, hiding fugitives in hollow trees. But most said she vanished, disappeared into myth, that her face became blurred. But her name, whispered from field to field, grew louder with time. Not Mary the slave, not Mary the Fastamata, but Mary the weapon, Mary the reckoning, Mary who turned her own body into a coffin for every man who mistook her for property. And though her bones may lie somewhere deep beneath cane and moss, her breath still moves when the wind passes low. Her voice still hums in the ears of women walking alone. And when men speak too boldly in rooms built on blood, sometimes they stop and shiver as if someone just walked over their grave. If this story stirred something deep inside you, it's because it wasn't told in vain. Subscribe so that other silenced voices can find their way. Like it. If what spilled here wasn't just blood but truth, and share it with those who carry in their hearts the memory of those who never had the chance to fight back.